Yes, so the Refresh teaching team, they asked me not only to host this event, but also to prepare a brief input on today's topic. So I'd like to give you two very simple suggestions on how you can make your oral exams more valid and fair. Okay, 1 second. My PowerPoint isn't. There we go. So in the first event on oral exams, what the presenters talked a lot about is how oral exams really are a unique form of assessment. And I think what makes oral exams unique is that it allows you to assess student abilities that you could not assess at all in a written exam or in a project, or you would assess them in a very different manner. So this includes things like engaging in an academic debate, problem solving on the spot, explaining things orally, ideation, critical thinking, or just more generally being part of an academic conversation in your field of expertise. Now, from this perspective, we can summarize certain distinctive advantages, but also challenges of oral exams as compared, for example, against written examinations. So first of all, one very unique advantage is oral exams are interactive, they're social, and usually they're quite authentic in the sense of engaging in an academic discourse. They're also dynamic and individual. So in contrast to a written examination, they enable you, the examiner, to follow up on a question, to probe more deeply, and really to adapt to the student, as Andreas just illustrated in his examples before. And finally, and I think this is also important, oral exams take place in a controlled setting that is actually quite fraud-proof. This is less of a distinction versus written exams, but in contrast to, say, graded presentations or theses, where we have much less control whether students might be ghostwriting or not. Oral exams, however, also introduce unique challenges. First of all, students usually are very unfamiliar with oral exams for the simple fact that only very few of their exams typically will be oral exams. It's a very stressful situation because if you perform poorly, if you don't know an answer, this happens in a social situation. So it's not anonymous as when you're writing an exam on paper. So it's a much more stressful situation than a written examination. Also, they're quite unstandardized and they require improvisation, which leads to the question whether because in an exam we're always also comparing students to each other. We expect the student who gets a 5 grade to have performed better than a student who got a 4.5. And since we have these very individual courses of action in an oral exam, it leads to the question whether we aren't comparing apples with oranges. And finally, oral exams are very fleeting. So there's no inherent track record of what is going on, but instead it requires deliberation to actually take notes and to take notes in an appropriate manner. So how can we take advantage of these benefits while addressing the shortcomings? So one thing I would like to suggest is to structure oral exams as a semi-structured interview, which mitigates the challenges and safeguards the advantages. And the other very important thing to think about is how we can address biases, because oral exams inherently are a situation that is much more prone to misjudgments due to biases than, say, a written exam. So if we think of the taxonomy of learning objectives, we have this idea of increasing complexity. And we have this idea that the higher up we go in the taxonomy, the more important the concept of transfer becomes in the assessment tasks we give students. So one way to think about this is as a pyramid, where the lower elements are very suitable for assessing the breadth of knowledge of students, whereas the higher elements are suitable for assessing the depth of knowledge. And now the way we can structure this in an oral exam is actually very similar to how Andreas just laid this out, is we structure the exam into different topics. We reserve a fixed amount of time for each topic, and then we enter into the topic with questions at the base of the taxonomy. So this might be simple knowledge questions, and then we progressively probe deeper. And we do this in a semi-structured way. So for example, you could prepare entry questions to a set of topics. Students might draw these topics with laws, how do you say in English? With papers they have to pick. You might then have specific transfer questions prepared where they need to apply the topic to a broader context, for example. And then ideally, the discussion will naturally transition into an expert discussion. And by having several iterations in this process, it should enable you to kind of find a balance between letting a natural expert discussion happen and still having a structured procedure that safeguards fairness for students. And for example, the presentation example of Andreas, we can easily accommodate in this structure simply by starting into the whole process with the student presentation. Now, essentially what we're doing here is we're turning the pyramid, the taxonomic pyramid, on its head. So you're taking a rather narrow entry point into the exam with knowledge questions. And actually, it's then the student's task, as you probe deeper, to increasingly start connecting the topics with larger topics, with other topics in the course, or even with topics outside of the course proper. Now, one way to do this, and this is really the very highly structured rubric, is for each of these fields, you can define evaluation criteria. You can also do holistic criteria, but I would say the structured example is a good place to start, and it's always easier to then follow up with more holistic criteria than the other way around. Now, these criteria don't have to be numbers, so the scores don't have to be numbers. They can also be notes. And so you have these scores, and then either by mathematical weighting or through deliberation between you and your co-examiner, you arrive at the final score. So then how do we address biases in oral exams? Now, oral exams are a situation that is very prone to judgment biases. And the judgment biases I would like to highlight now are a bit different to the ones that we're perhaps most sensitive for, which is gender, which is ethnicity, which is socioeconomic background. All these things are important, but there are also many others. So, for example, the attire and hygiene of your candidates may influence your assessment of the candidate. How eloquent is the candidate? How confident is the candidate? Is the candidate charming or socially awkward? Or actually just simple attractiveness can influence our judgments of people. But then there are also other factors that don't have anything to do with the candidate per se. So for example, the time of day or the weekday can have an influence on how strict or severe you are in your judgments of the candidates. Whether you are hungry or rested, your mood, the prior candidate anchors your judgment of the subsequent candidate. So if I'm a candidate to an exam and my prior candidate was very poor, this is quite an advantage for myself. And finally, also completely extraneous factors, as for example, the weather, may influence our mood and thereby also our judgments. Now, the important thing to understand here is, first, it will never be possible to entirely remove these biases from your judgments without at the same time sacrificing the advantages of oral exams. However, we can mitigate these effects quite efficiently. Because these effects unduly affect our judgments, especially then when we are not aware of them. So let's say you had a very nervous, not eloquent candidate with maybe questionable attire. And this candidate might have made you feel uneasy during the exam. Now, if you don't make yourself conscious that it's actually these things that made you feel slightly uneasy, you will attribute this feeling of uneasiness to the candidate's performance, and it will have a strong influence on your evaluation of the candidate. So really, the most important mitigating measure is try and make yourself aware of these potential biases, and thereby you will already be remediating their effects. Try and implement consistently structured procedures. So this can be following the example I made. It can be something entirely different. The important thing is that you really implement and apply it consistently. Deliberate and coordinate with your co-examiner. Keep your cognitive load manageable. So if you have a co-examiner, don't both focus on the same things, but instead focus on different things, because this, for both of you, will reduce your cognitive load. When you have a reduced cognitive load, you will be less susceptible to the biases. Take notes and document your exam, and importantly, take regular breaks.